Good evening. I'm Jim Gierach, and welcome to the 5th edition of Chicago's War on Drugs. Today is May 2nd, 2017, and today's good news is that eventually the war on drugs will end. And when it ends, the Al Capone-like prohibition, the violence will end along with it. The flood of fentanyl-laced opiate overdose deaths will also subside, and the racist war on drugs that picks on blacks and browns and the poor will end with it. America will cast off its mantle as the prison capital of the world that claims 25% of the world's 10 million prisoners, a drug war scar on the land of the free. On that Prohibition Emancipation Day, what goes into a person's mouth or body will be their private business, a constitutionally protected right, as much as the speech that comes out of that person's mouth or pen. Some days I get discouraged. Attorney General Jeff Sessions talked about cranking up the war on drugs. President Trump talks about building a $40 to $70 billion wall to stop the drugs from flowing into this country. Or a newspaper editorial greets the prospect of recreational marijuana in Illinois with the advice, let's wait and see. Waiting and doing nothing costs Illinois an estimated $350 to $700 million in lost tax revenues annually. That lost revenue instead goes to support Chicago gangs and international drug cartels. Tuesdays, for 13 weeks, we are going to be asking on this show the central question, which is worse, drugs or the war on drugs? There is no right or wrong answer on this show. This is simply an important heart-to-heart discussion about drug prohibition and its consequences. This 13-week show is brought to you courtesy of Azteca Baseball League, a not-for-profit organization that can be reached at the website shown and also at the phone number shown. Or if you'd like, you could contact us through drugnews1@yahoo.com. Well, we also have further good news tonight. This is a call-in show where you have the right to call and ask questions and make comments. And the good news is that we have Brian Gaughan. Brian, how are you tonight?
Doing well, Jim. How about yourself?
Good. Brian is a former police officer, a former paramedic, and a speaker with an organization called Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. Brian, you heard the question, which is worse, drugs or the war on drugs? What do you think?
I think absolutely the answer is unequivocally the war on drugs. It's much more devastating to individuals, to communities, to cities, to our nation as a whole. The war on drugs has destroyed families. Just the amount of violence that is perpetuated by drug prohibition takes far more lives than drug overdoses do in this country. To me, it's an absolute no-brainer. The answer to that question is the war on drugs is far more devastating to our country.
Tell me about the organization that you're with, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition.
It's an organization that consists of several hundred thousand police officers and supporters. Members are current law enforcement officers, former law enforcement officers, jailers, prosecutors, judges. It runs the whole gamut, from chiefs of police of major cities, one being former police chief of Seattle, Washington, all the way down to literally small towns that have one or two police officers. And it's a group that's come together and decided that the idea of drug prohibition is a complete fallacy, that you're going to change anyone's mind or change the usage of drugs or change the amount of people who are dependent on drugs. And we've reached the conclusion that what we really need to do is stop the war on drugs, i.e. prohibition. What we should have learned from doing it to alcohol. We see the failure from the war on alcohol, and it's just a group of people that came together and decided if we didn't have prohibition on drugs, we could control them, we could regulate them, It would be done much the same as we control and regulate alcohol, tobacco. As it is now, with just a complete prohibition, a blanket prohibition on drugs, we have given that control and regulation over to street gangs and drug cartels. Once we took over control and regulation of alcohol, and to a lesser extent tobacco, violence completely dropped. When we see the amount of killings, just being a law enforcement organization, we look at the amount of police officers that were killed throughout the nation during prohibition of alcohol, and it was as high as 300 officers annually were killed. Once alcohol prohibition was overturned, the amount of officers killed in this country went on a steady downhill slide, and it went all that way until the early 70s when President Nixon declared the war on drugs. In the early 70s, we started to see a ramp up again of law enforcement officer deaths. So drug prohibition, it is wrong for people on both sides of the law. It negatively impacts law enforcement and negatively impacts citizens of this country.
And what effect has the war on drugs had on the relationship between the police and its citizens?
It has devastated it. I can't think of a worse time of a relationship between the police departments and citizens of this community, of the communities throughout this country. Just today on the news, I heard that the Chicago Crime Commission is implementing a phone bank that people can call to report crimes if they feel uncomfortable calling the police department to report crimes. I mean, to me, that should be such an eye-opener to people, that there is a huge gap and a huge divide between the trust between citizens and law enforcement officers. And it's a gap that is, both sides have created this. I really think we are generations, and that's plural, away from bridging that gap where people once again trust law enforcement and law enforcement realizes that they're there to serve the population. People who aren't involved in drugs, are not involved in crime, and they are on a regular basis, sometimes multiple times per month, are pulled over, their cars are ransacked by officers, their backpacks are dumped out, and what are those police searching for? Two things: drugs and guns. They're not there to look to recover stolen property. They're not looking for evidence of other crimes. Looking for drugs and guns. And a lot of times those people aren't involved in drugs or guns. So once that happens so many times, again and again and again, those people really develop a distrust of police officers. They don't trust them, and they don't want to go to them when they're aware of actual crimes in their community. That's why, going back to the Chicago Crime Commission, they have to come up with some other tactic. And I think we're generations away from bridging that gap.
Now, Brian, I saw an article some time ago that was in the Chicago Tribune, and they had a rather startling report on a study that had been done, and the excerpt from that article says African Americans in Cook County were imprisoned for drug offenses at 58 times the rate of white people, the 7th worst racial disparity among large counties nationwide, according to the report. I mean, those figures are just staggering.
Absolutely staggering.
And then if you talk about the violence on the west side and the south side of Chicago, when you have a community that is really being targeted, it would seem, how does that affect police-community relations?
It affects it very negatively. Every study that's done as far as drug usage amongst various races, it shows that there is usually an equal amount of white people and non-white people. Drug usage is pretty even across all racial boundaries and all socioeconomic levels. So to show that non-white people are arrested 58 times the rate of white people, that is a very shocking figure, and people should sit up and take notice of that.
Rachel Alexander wrote a book called The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. And as I'm sure you're aware, we have taken this war on drugs that was declared by President Nixon in 1971 and a population of 200,000 or 300,000 in our prison system, and now going to what? 2.2 million
Yes.
roughly incarcerated. So that America, as I said here in the opening, we instead of the land of the free, we are the prison capital of the world.
Right.
25% of the population of the world's prisoners we own. here in America. Well, I saw a caller. Do we have a caller?
Yes, and good afternoon, gentlemen. How you doing?
Good
Number
afternoon.
one,
Thank you.
I think the officers in the street, you got to look for the drugs. You got to look for the guns because it's destroying people, we're killing people, and it's just senseless. But the other part, I understand that you said that we have regulated alcohol and tobacco. I think that's a joke. That's truly a joke. I mean, people are still buying cigarette, younger people. They still buying alcohol. And alcohol is a drug. And now they want to legalize marijuana, in which we have noticed that is also a drug. Now, the thing is, we need to, how about the doctors? The doctors writing out all these scripts for people out here to get drugs. They also got methadone programs, and they still giving people methadone. Now, methadone been given out since.
All right, well, caller, let's, before you get too far away from your first point, let's ask Brian what he has to say about that.
Yes, sir. Actually, you are correct. There are too many guns out there. But we have to go back to the initial question: why are people riding around in their car with guns? They're riding around their car with guns to either use them offensively or defensively. And in both of those instances, it involves turf control. And why are they trying to control the turf? Because that's the turf they want to control to sell their illegal drugs. If drugs were legal, they wouldn't have to carry. There wouldn't be so much gun violence. People wouldn't be carrying guns. Over 80%, according to our Superintendent Gary McCarthy, he says over 80% of the shootings and gun violence in this city are directly related to gang violence regarding drug turf. People wouldn't be shooting each other if they weren't trying to control a neighborhood or a street corner. That's why there's so many guns on the street. And you mentioned alcohol. I don't know of too many cases where people are standing on a street corner selling cans of Budweiser or bottles of whiskey. It's controlled and it's regulated. We saw a drastic reduction in both police officer deaths and in civilian deaths once we remove prohibition of alcohol. We don't see today, guys from the Coors distributorship doing a drive-by shooting at the Budweiser distributorship. Why? Because those sales are controlled and regulated. But we did see gangs, organized crime, different divisions of organized crime back in the 20s and early 30s doing drive-by shootings exactly over the sale of alcohol and who controlled the sale of alcohol. Once we removed that profit incentive from them and controlled and regulated it, the violence went down. And I think we should learn from the past.
We've had people die of bathtub gin in those old days that our caller was speaking of. And of course, when we started regulating and controlling drugs, and people knew when they bought something at the store and it was government inspected and it was government regulated when it was manufactured and they had a label on it that told you the alcohol content, people were safer. Even though alcohol still presents a risk, at least the user could protect themselves. But now tell us, based on your experience as a paramedic and firefighter, what effect has this war on drugs had on the quality and the nature of the drugs people are ingesting?
Well, the bad thing is they don't know what they're buying. When they buy a white powdery substance from someone on a street corner, they don't know what they're buying, and the person who is selling to them, they don't really know what they're selling them. They just know they purchased from somebody else, and that person purchased from somebody else. There's no quality control. The vast majority of overdose deaths that we see in this country now, with our so-called opioid epidemic, is due to tainted drugs. People are adding fentanyl. That's the big killer now. People are putting fentanyl into heroin to make it more attractive. Unfortunately, no one knows what's in that white powdery substance. If that white powdery substance they were purchasing it from a drugstore, there would be regulation, there would be control over the manufacturing process, the ingredients of that drug they're ingesting. People, like as Jim said, people don't die from homemade gin anymore, but there were thousands of deaths per year over poisoned alcohol during alcohol prohibition.
I believe the number is 991 people that died of opiate overdoses in the prior year in the 4 counties of DuPage, Will, Cook, and Lake. And many of those deaths, of course, are because heroin, an opioid, is being mixed with fentanyl. And
Correct.
can you explain to me what's the difference between heroin and fentanyl and how the two are related and what effect that has on death?
Well, they're both opioids, and heroin, as toxic as it is less toxic than fentanyl. Fentanyl is an extremely condensed opioid product, and people mix it with heroin because it's readily available. It's an actual legal drug. I mean, there is a drug, fentanyl, that doctors can prescribe.
What do they use fentanyl for legally?
It's a pain reliever. It's an opioid pain reliever, but it's extremely powerful, and people put that in heroin. And you never know how much is the heroin, how much fentanyl has been added to the heroin you're ingesting, and that's why the majority of people who overdose and die from ingesting what they assume to be heroin are actually ingesting a mixture of fentanyl and heroin.
So it's a killer, and I suppose a person who's using drugs, if they can't read the label, they can't try and protect themselves, even though you and I would prefer, I'm sure, that they weren't using it to begin with.
Absolutely. It's
But
very dangerous.
It's not our decision whether they're going to use it or not. People who have free will in a free society decide what they're going to put in their body.
Correct. Everybody knows how toxic cigarettes are and how many deaths they're responsible for in this country every year, and people still choose to smoke. But since cigarettes are legal and they're controlled and they're regulated, and a lot of that money is actually used to educate people of how dangerous cigarettes are, that's why cigarette use in this country continues to decline. So
I actually think the number of deaths related to cigarette use in this country has plummeted in half. They put in place an international convention. It was not part of the United Nations. It was outside the United Nations with the World Health Organization that put the treaty in place. And it basically recognized that you can't make people stop smoking by putting in place a prohibition, and so that instead it's better to regulate and control it, to prohibit advertising on TV and in magazines, and to use taxation as a method of regulation rather than trying to use prohibition as a stick.
right, instead, it also to reduce it, instead of using prohibition, use education. They educate people like how dangerous this is. I mean, that's why people aren't smoking. I mean, youngsters know that smoking's bad for you. They know it now.
No. Well, why do you suppose it is that with the war on drugs being such a monumental failure, and everyone, 83% agreeing that we're losing or have lost the war on drugs, why are we not making more progress publicly? Why do we have, for example, a recent newspaper editorial saying, let's go slow and sit on our hands with even marijuana, which is to many people a medicine. And we have a newspaper editorializing, let's sit on our hands, let's forego the $350 to $700 million, let's let the drug cartels and the street gangs have the money, let's let them use the guns to kill each other here in Chicago and make our expressways unsafe. How can it be that public opinion and thought can be so cramped, so brain cramped? Tell me.
I wish I knew the answer to that. I really wish I knew the answer. I don't want to become a nation of just subservient people. Like no one really wants to think outside the box and come out with an idea that says, this is wrong. What we've been doing for the last 40 years, it's wrong. Yeah. No one really wants to jump on that. Everybody wants to just go with the flow.
The same newspaper that editorialized and said we should sit on our hands and be careful about legalizing recreational cannabis editorially said just 7 years ago that we had lost the war on drugs. It's over, we've lost, and it's time to put in place rules and laws that make sense. And yet the same institution that came up with the former article came up with a renewed call for continuation of prohibition. It's hard to talk sense to power when power makes no sense.
That's absolutely right, yeah.
Well, so tell us some more about your experience as a policeman or paramedic that you think would be helpful to our viewers.
We come from a law enforcement officer for 11 years and then a fire department paramedic for 23 years. It really became obvious to me as, I was coming towards the tail end of my law enforcement career and becoming a firefighter paramedic, that drug usage, drug abuse, whatever you want to term it, it really should never be viewed as a law enforcement issue. It is absolutely, positively a medical issue. Drug addicts should not be arrested. They shouldn't be incarcerated. It's a medical issue. And I think when law enforcement decides to start getting involved in a medical issue, then we have problems. I think there should be a definite boundary between what's a crime and what is a medical issue. And I've had a discussion actually with a lot of law enforcement officers who are friends of mine when they started carrying Narcan, which is a drug that you can administer to somebody who is suffering from an opioid overdose. And I mean, that drug literally is an absolute lifesaver. And I had police officers tell me, well, I don't want, and all it is a spray. It's a spray. You spray up someone's nostril that they would carry in law enforcement officers. And we've seen over the last couple of years throughout the metropolitan Chicago area, countless and countless of lives that have been saved by police officers for carrying that Narcan. But I had officers tell me, well, no, I don't want to carry that because I'm not a paramedic and I'm not an EMT, I'm a policeman. And I would usually get them to change their mind when I would say, well, are you trained in CPR annually? Do you have to get a CPR card through your police department? Oh, yes, we do. Do you carry an automatic defibrillator in the trunk of your squad car for when people are in cardiac arrest? Yes, I do. I said, do you have any problem doing either that CPR or using that AED? Oh, not at all. I said, well, then why would you hesitate to put a spray up someone's nostril? And I really had to point out the hypocrisy to what they were trying to tell me. Well, they're here to protect people and save lives, unless it's a guy who's a drug addict. So I said, well, it's okay if it's a guy having a heart attack, but not a guy who is suffering from an overdose. And I really kind of changed a handful of guys' minds, and they understand that it is something that law enforcement should be carrying.
Yeah, your comment makes me think of what I read oftentimes in the newspaper these days, where one person shoots and kills another one, and then the footnote is that, well, he was a documented gang member. Like, that doesn't count as a human being anymore.
Right.
It's just
tragic.
One despicable consequence of the war on drugs after another. The problems of gangs, guns, prisons, deficits, corruption, excessive police use of force, just so many problems.
Broken families, unemployment, I mean, the list can go on.
The trade imbalance. We're talking about building a wall along the south border of the United States when you can fly these ultralights over it and drop a veil. You can't protect the whole 2,000 yards. They're buying corruption. We can't keep fences to keep drugs out of prisons.
Yeah, we can't keep, there's not a day goes by in the most stringent maximum security penitentiaries in this country that drugs are not recovered. Every day, every single day, at every maximum security prison in this country, drugs are found. If we can't keep drugs out of a maximum security prison where we control everybody who comes in and who leaves and what packages come in and what leaves, how someone thinks that building a 40-foot wall along our southern border will stop drugs from coming into this country, I don't follow that logic at all.
I mean, we could lay all the Trump buildings down on their side, and it wouldn't cost us so much to put the fence up.
Right.
We really have to figure out how to get some people who are in positions of power to come forward and say that it's time to reconsider the war on drugs. We have 4 people, or at least running for governor. We've invited 3 of them to be on the show. We hope that they're going to take us up and let us know what they think of Illinois and Chicago's war on drugs. Are they for it or against it? We're inviting columnists. We're trying to get a trauma physician to come on the show and get a different perspective. We had a law enforcement officer, paramedic. We've had a cannabis patient. We've had a harm reduction expert in naloxone and methadone programs. So we are going to continue to try and bring during this 13 weeks people from various perspectives. And Brian, you've certainly done a great job, I think, today.
Thank you, sir.
And bringing those views forward. Next week, we're going to have for you Reverend Sharp with clergy for a new drug policy. I look forward to seeing you then with Chicago's War on Drugs. I'm Jim Gierach, and good night.